Good morning all and welcome to this webinar examining rules of origin. I'm so pleased you can join us as determining the rules of origin for your product can be a daunting task, but one which is essential to get right. My name is Catherine and I'm the Export Coordinator for the Department for International Trade, and today's speaker is Lucinda O'Reilly from the International Trade Consultancy. Lucinda has over 15 years of experience exporting goods across the globe, and the International Trade Consultancy helps companies successfully export through providing custom support and guidance, but I will let her introduce herself properly in a minute. So today is part of the National Export Academy programme, a free series of events and webinars run by the Department for International Trade to help companies gain a deeper understanding of all the aspects of exporting, so you can begin to make money by selling internationally. New events are constantly being added to the programme, so do keep an eye on the events agenda, as I wouldn't want you to miss out on the brilliant sessions like today. Following the webinar, I will send around the slides and the recording, as well as Lucinda's details. So if you have any further questions that we don't get to answer today, you can contact her directly. After the presentation, there'll be a live Q&A, and the joy of being a webinar. No one can see you ask the questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. So if you do have anything you want to ask, please pop them into the Q&A box and I'll ask them to Lucinda at the end. Please be aware, though, that due to the large number of companies joining us today, I may not ask your question to everyone if it's a very niche sector-based question. That is enough from me. Lucinda, over to you.
Hi, Catherine. Can you see me yet?
We can't see you, but we can see the slides.
Okay, well, that's the most important thing. So let's just get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this in-depth webinar about rules of origin and the latest customs regulations that came into force on January 1st. My name is Lucinda O'Reilly, and for many years I was the Exports Director of an industrial flooring manufacturer based in Luton. The product was exported to over 40 countries worldwide, so I have a lot of practical experience of trading under many different customs frameworks, and a large proportion of turnover was generated by distributors and end users in the EU. So I was responsible for ensuring that we continue to trade successfully with those customers post-Brexit. Having achieved that and developed the correct processes to follow, I decided to set up my consultancy in May last year to help other companies do the same thing, which is why I'm talking to you today. So the broad areas that I'm going to discuss today are: what are non-preferential rules of origin, preferential rules of origin. It's very important to understand the difference. What is accumulation? How does it apply to your businesses? Can you make use of it? Because it's a very useful tool. The process for determining rules of origin. That's going to be extremely useful to you. Proving preferential origin and what to do if your products don't comply. Some frequently asked questions that might give you some insight into how all of this applies to your business. And some other changes that came into effect on January 1st this year regarding import declarations and commodity codes. So apologies for covering old ground, but it's always worth reminding ourselves of the context before we think about anything relating to how we trade with the EU now. Especially as quite a few changes came into force at the beginning of this month. When the UK was a member of the European Union, we benefited from frictionless trade, which meant that goods travelled back and forth without the need for customs declarations or import duty in either direction. From January 1st, 2021, trade has been conducted between the two countries according to the terms of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreements. And while you will have heard it described as a zero tariff, zero quota deal, there are conditions that goods need to meet for that to be the case. And that's where the rules of origin come in. So let's work out what rules of origin are. We'll start with non-preferential rules of origin. So the term origin in the context of international trade is a very important concept because it's central to determining the customs duties and taxes related to a specific good, as well as to some trade restrictions such as quotas or labelling. Rules of origin are the rules that determine where a good was obtained or manufactured. So basically it's economic nationality. And a lot of people find this confusing and think that having imported goods from China, for example, if they then re-export those goods to another customs territory like the EU, they can say the goods are of UK origin because that's where they're being sent from. But this is not correct, as I'll explain in more detail later on. So non-preferential rules of origin are those which apply in the absence of any trade agreement. So when trade is conducted on a World Trade Organization, which is also known as most favored nation basis. Not all countries apply specific legislation related to non-preferential rules of origin. But some trade policy measures such as quotas, anti-dumping duties or made-in labels may require a determination of origin and therefore the application of non-preferential rules. The current example would be the tariffs that Donald Trump imposed on steel and aluminium from the EU and the UK. Joe Biden has removed the tariffs from the EU, but not the UK, making British steel and aluminium much more expensive. So non-preferential rules are usually decided on a unilateral national level, whereas preferential rules are agreed in trade agreements between two or more parties. And non-preferential rules of origin use two criteria to determine origin: wholly obtained and last substantial transformation. So I will just look at those in a bit more detail for you. Wholly obtained is fairly straightforward. It covers the cases in which a good is entirely obtained, extracted, or manufactured in a single country without using parts imported from other countries. So that would be, for example, natural products extracted, harvested, hunted, or caught in a country, or any good produced in a country exclusively from other wholly obtained goods from that country. So an example of that could be beer made in the UK, as you can get all of the ingredients for beer. All of the ingredients can be grown or obtained in the UK. So it's possible to manufacture beer that is UK origin under non-preferential rules. Substantially transformed goods are those which are produced from or with imported materials, or those which require processing in different countries. And attributing the origin of a good to a single country can be a complex exercise in these circumstances, because several materials, parts, processes, or a large number of countries may be involved. The purpose of the rule of origin in these circumstances, therefore, is to clearly identify when exactly a transformation takes place. That is, when the final product resulting from a process is sufficiently different from the inputs used to manufacture it. In general, the criteria of last substantial transformation is expressed in three ways: by a rule requiring a change of tariff subheading in the harmonized system nomenclature, by a value added rule where the increase of value due to assembly operations and incorporation of originating materials represents a specified level of the ex works price of the product. Sorry, I know that's a bit of a mouthful. I will give you an example later, which makes it easier to understand. And the final criteria that could be used if you are trying to achieve non-preferential origin is by, there's a list of manufacturing or processing operations that you could employ in the manufacturing process that would mean that the goods meet the origin rules. So you need to remember that not all countries use non-preferential rules of origin, and they're not used to implement trade preferences. Instead, they're used in the context of other trade policy measures such as quotas, anti-dumping, food and health measures, and labelling. So you might be thinking, if there's no duty benefit to proving non-preferential origin of my product, what's the point of it? So I'll just give you an example of quotas where you can see that it can actually be quite important. Imports of beef into the European Union are regulated by a quota. Each country may export beef to the EU until the specified number of tonnes is reached, and rules of origin are used to track the imports and control the extent to which the quota allocated to each country is being used. If the EU quota for beef states that Argentina can export 100,000 tonnes of beef to the EU, and Brazil can only export 50,000 tonnes, it's in the interests of Argentinian beef farmers to be able to prove that their cattle are Argentinian, because they've got a much better chance of selling it to the EU because the quota is higher. So these are the kinds of things that are subject to constant developments and changes, and it's important to be aware of them so you can take advantage of anything that might give you the edge over your competitors. So now we're going to look at preferential rules of origin. And this is with particular reference to those laid down in the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The TCA and free trade agreements in general will provide very specific detail about things like origin conditions, wholly produced, what constitutes sufficient transformation, what the conditions must be if any processing takes place in the UK, what the conditions must be if processing outside the UK or in a partner beneficiary country, what the minimal processes are, and also exceptions to the rules. So these free trade agreements are written in enormous levels of detail, and you do need to go through them very, very carefully to make sure you understand them properly with reference to your particular product. So in a general sense, the purpose of preferential origin is to provide duty benefits through free trade agreements. Rules of origin ensure that the benefits of an agreement are only given to those products which originate in one of the parties to the agreement. And it's important to note that the rules of origin which apply to an international transaction are always that of the importing country. You don't have to use them, but if you do, it can give you the advantage over your competitors by allowing reduced or free duty into the country of destination. So that goes back to the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement: zero tariffs, zero quotas, but only if you meet the rules of origin. And we'll get into this in more detail later, but you must ensure that you comply with all the rules relevant to your HS code, your commodity code. And you should also be aware that invoice declarations made in relation to preferential origin are legal statements. So there are three main rules of origin that need to be considered when determining the preferential origin of a product. And you'll notice they're the same as the last substantial transformation criteria for non-preferential rules. So again, we're looking at the tariff shift rule, the value percentage rule, and the specific process rule. One or a combination of these must be satisfied if goods are to qualify for preferential tariff treatment on export or import. Importers need to use them to establish whether their goods have met the rules for preferential tariff treatment, i.e. a reduction or elimination of import duty. Exporters and manufacturers must ensure compliance for their finished products which are going to be exported under preference, or for components or parts which are going to be used as materials for the manufacturing products which will then be exported under preference or re-exported if you imported them in the first place. In this last instance, where you import goods and use them to manufacture a product that will be re-exported, you need to know about the no drawback rule. And I'll talk about that in more detail later. So let's look again at exactly what's involved in complying with these rules. The tariff shift rule is fairly straightforward. The exact terms will vary from trade agreement to trade agreement. But an example would be that all material used, also known as the inputs, used to manufacture something must be classified in a tariff heading different from the final product. So an example of that would be if you were manufacturing leather handbags and you imported the leather, which has tariff subheading 4104. Maybe you source the buckle locally, that's tariff subheading 8308, and you imported the zip as well, which is 9607. Now the final HS code of the handbag, the tariff subheading, is 4202. So the final heading is different to all of the different HS codes of the products that went into manufacturing that handbag. So under those circumstances, you can say that even though you imported a large percentage of the inputs, you have done enough to it to, well, there's been enough of a tariff heading to qualify for preferential origin. The value percentage rule is as described in the non-preferential rules section. The free trade agreement that you're looking at, whichever one it is, whether it's the UK EU one or UK South Korea, whichever FTA you're looking at, it will be very clear about what percentage in value the raw materials cost is allowed to be of the final selling price of a product. And it will vary for each commodity code. So it's really important to check the relevant FTA's rules. An example of this could be chemical fertilizers, which are largely made of 3 elements: ammonium nitrate, potassium chloride, and ammonium phosphate. The compounds are blended together in different proportions and then granulated or diluted in water and packaged. Now, assume a manufacturer imports these 3 elements from 3 different countries and uses his or her expertise to blend them. And the fertilizer is then exported to another country. The rule of origin for this HS code, chemical fertilizers, which is 3105, could say that at least 60% of the final value of the goods must have been added locally. So non-originating materials, the imported inputs, must not be more than 40% of the final price. So even though all of the inputs were imported, it's not a problem as long as the final price is the only 40% of the final price is made up of the cost of those inputs. So if your Ex Works price to your customers is £100 per bag, you can't have spent more than £40 per bag on the things that you use to manufacture it. And it's really important to know that labour, overhead costs, profit, research and other things like that are considered to be originating. So do not include any of those in the material costs. Non-originating materials are tangible items, and as I just said, the price you use for these calculations is the Ex Works price. This is a good place to mention the general tolerance rule, also called the de minimis rule. The description I've just given of the value percentage rule makes it sound fairly easy to calculate, but for some products it can be very complicated. as it requires an in-depth knowledge of the bill of materials in relation to values, origin, and the HS codes, all of which might change from month to month if you have a selection of suppliers in different countries. You know, everyone's got very complex supply chains these days, so keeping on top of all those things can be extremely complicated. And with this in mind, most free trade agreements include a general tolerance rule. Now, this allows for a predefined maximum percentage of non-originating materials to be used without affecting the origin, which is very useful for products where there is only a small portion of non-originating materials in the bill of materials, but there are a lot of inputs from lots of different places. So this rule provides that the final product receives preferential origin status, provided that the total value of the non-originating components does not exceed a certain minimal percentage, which would usually be 5, 10 or 15% of the ex-works price of the product. But also, any of the percentages defined under the list rules for the maximum value of non-originating materials are not exceeded. So this last one is a bit tricky if you're not familiar with free trade agreements, but it's referring to the fact that they all have lists, and the items on those lists may be restricted as to the percentage that are allowed to contribute to a final product, in addition to the overall percentage of non-originating inputs that are allowed. So to explain this more clearly with an example, the general tolerance rule for fertilizer might state that the overall percentage of non-originating materials allowed is 15%. And also that the allowable percentage of non-originating ammonium nitrate that can be used is 5%. So if you're going to use the general tolerance rule, you need to check what the total percentage value of non-originating inputs is, and if any of the inputs are on a list that restricts the percentage contribution of those individual inputs. Just be aware that certain product categories are excluded from this general tolerance rule or have a more specific tolerance rule. For example, textile products classified under HS chapters 50 to 63. So again, you need to read the FTA quite carefully. The general tolerance rule should be tested first when you are trying to work out compliance, before considering the specific list rules, just because it will save you a lot of time if you can qualify under those criteria. When met, the final product has obtained the preferential origin of the manufacturing country. And finally, let's look at the specific process rule. To check whether your products comply with the specific process rule, it's necessary to refer to the annex of the rules of origin in the free trade agreement, which specifies the list of working or processing required to be carried out on non-originating materials. So the clue's in the name. The relevant annex of the FTA will be extremely specific about which processes, when used to make a product, confer originating status and which ones don't. The ones that do can vary quite a bit from agreement to agreement and will be influenced by the most highly prized industrial processes in each territory. But the ones that are generally considered not sufficient include things like preserving operations to make sure that the products remain in good condition during transport and storage, a change of packaging, breaking up an assembly of packages. These are things that you might do if your goods were in a customs warehouse, for example. If you'd imported some products from somewhere and for whatever reason they were going to be stuck there for longer than you thought, and you decide that you want to go in and make sure that the packaging is going to be sufficient for the duration they're going to be in the warehouse, or for marketing reasons you want to go in and change the packaging, those things do not constitute qualification for preferential origin under the specific process rules. Other things that do not qualify would be washing, cleaning, removal of dust, oxide, oil, paint or other coverings, ironing or pressing of textiles, simple painting and polishing operations, husking, partial or total bleaching of cereals and rice, operations to colour or flavour sugar or form sugar lumps, peeling, stoning and shelling of fruits, nuts and vegetables, sharpening, simple grinding. I mean, you can see that the list, I could go on for ages, the list is very, very comprehensive. And these are just the things that do not qualify for preferential origin. So you can imagine that the list of specific processes that do is even more complex. So as you can see, it's called the specific process rule for a reason, and there are important variations from FTA to FTA, which is why it's so important to check. And now I'm sure you'd be very glad to get off this slide whilst we have a look at cumulation. Cumulation can be a very valuable tool when it comes to origin if used correctly. While in principle all processes for origin purposes must have been carried out in a single country to be considered as originating, sometimes the rules may accept the use of imported parts from selected countries. That is, imported parts would be considered to be domestic for origin purposes. And there are 4 types of cumulation, and they're all aimed towards a more flexible approach when claiming preferential origin by allowing more combinations in product or raw materials sharing between multiple countries. So the simplest version, if you like, of cumulation is bilateral cumulation. This operates between 2 countries where a free trade agreement or an autonomous arrangement contains a provision allowing them to cumulate origin. This is the basic type of cumulation and is common to all origin arrangements. Only originating products or materials can benefit from it. And an example would be if you're a UK manufacturer and you use inputs, materials, components from the EU to make your finished product, obviously a higher percentage than that allowed in the value percentage rule, you can still claim that the goods are of UK origin when you export them because of the cumulation clause in the trade and cooperation agreement. The next type of cumulation is diagonal, and this operates between more than 2 countries, provided that they have free trade agreements containing identical origin rules and provision for cumulation between them. As with bilateral cumulation, only originating products or materials can benefit from diagonal cumulation. Although more than 2 countries can be involved in the manufacture of a product, it will have the origin of the country where the last working or processing operation took place, provided that it was more than a minimal operation. So in those circumstances, you might want to think about where you are then going to export the product to and whether that country has a trade agreement with where you're manufacturing, or whether they have a trade agreement with where one of the partner countries is manufacturing. Because obviously, if there is a trade agreement, you're going to want the last processing to happen in the country that does have the free trade agreement, so that you can benefit from the preferential rules there as well. Regional cumulation is a form of diagonal cumulation which only exists under the generalized system of preferences beneficiary countries. For example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And for anyone who's not aware, the generalized system of preferences is a preferential tariff system that developed countries extend to developing countries. So this is a type of cumulation you could use if you're importing parts from some African nations. For example, if you look up the HS code on the UK tariff, you would see a note next to it saying that if you imported the product from Australia, perhaps, then it would attract 10% import duty. But if you imported it from one of the GSP countries, they get a special deal and there would be no import duty to pay because you're supporting the economy of that country. Finally, full cumulation provides for the working or processing carried out in one country to be counted as if it were carried out in the country of production of the final product. This means that if your goods have been worked or processed in a country not in the agreement, you may still be able to consider them as originating. If the value added rule applies, cumulation means that the value added to non-originating materials in another country does not have to be included in the percentage maximum threshold. And if the manufacture from certain products rule applies, working on processing undertaken on non-originating materials can be counted towards any conditions which must be met. So you can see that cumulation is a very useful tool, especially if you have a global supply chain but want to claim origin in a certain country because it will reduce or eliminate duties. You really do need to have a forensic understanding of your bill of materials, however, and be prepared to monitor the origin and processing of all the inputs obsessively so that you don't inadvertently fail to comply with the rules. And I'm going to talk about some additional considerations now, because on top of everything that I've just talked about that you have to think about with relation to non-preferential and preferential, there are other things that you need to be aware of to make sure that you stay within the rules. So the first of these is the principle of territoriality. When goods are being manufactured, the manufacturing process needs to be completed uninterrupted within the country that is claiming the preferential origin. Unless, of course, you're using one of the cumulation options that I just explained. But generally speaking, the manufacturing needs to be done within one country where you want to claim origin. The next rule is the direct transport rule. And it's defined as a condition where the originating product must be transported directly without any interruption from the country of origin to the destination country from where the preferential origin is claimed. If not, I say country there, I should really say customs territory, because obviously you can move things around between the EU countries without any problems. So let's say customs territory, sorry. If not, preferential origin can no longer be guaranteed and the customs authorities will disregard any preferential certificate upon arrival, resulting in the application of the full duties. But an exception is made when the goods concerned transit through a third country that is part of a cumulation zone that includes both the country of origin and the destination country. For example, if you were sending goods from Germany to Italy and the truck went through Switzerland or through the third country, provided a single transport document covers the entire flow and includes transit under customs supervision, which is a special procedure, but that's a different webinar, through the third country. So this highlights the importance of understanding special procedures and working with a good logistics partner who can advise you regarding these matters. It's also obviously useful to be fully aware of customs territories and trade agreements that those customs territories have with each other. So, for example, the EU and the EFTA countries, which I think is Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. So yeah, need to be aware of all these things to make sure that you're not breaking any rules and to make sure that you get the benefit of the rules. Right, now the no drawback rule, which I mentioned earlier, is very important to be aware of. It does not allow an importer to apply a duty suspension regime upon import of the components if afterwards the finished product is exported claiming the preferential origin. So you can't have it both ways. The no drawback rule will prevent a trader's ability to benefit from using preferential certificates of origin in combination with another customs regime that softens the duty payments, for example, inward processing relief. An economic operator must choose to either apply a customs suspension regime or to provide a certificate of preferential origin upon export. There is a no drawback clause in the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So all customs duties and equivalent charges must be paid on any materials, components or parts imported to manufacture a finished product on which preference will be claimed if re-exported. Or the other way around, you can avoid paying the duty, but then when you export them, your customer can't claim preference and they will have to pay the import duty. So you must decide if you should either claim the reduced amount of customs duty on any imported materials used in manufacturing the goods, if available under inward processing relief, or pay any duties due and issue a preference document so your customer can claim preference and reduce import duty on the finished product they buy from you. So, you know, that just requires a calculation as to where you're going to save the most money. I mean, obviously, whichever one you choose affects the final price that you're selling to your customer at, but it's up to you which way around you do it. Another consideration is accounting segregation. This can be useful in complex manufacturing processes where one source of the raw materials or components has preferential origin, and the same raw materials components are also sourced from somewhere without preferential origin. This happens quite frequently. You know, lots of people have different suppliers for the same thing, just to, you know, hedge their bets, if you like, especially with the disruption to supply chains recently. So this happens quite frequently. You may be importing widgets from a country where you can claim preference and widgets from a country where you can't. Now, customs authorities can allow companies to use both in the further processing or working status without keeping physical track of the origin. You need to file a written request in advance with customs, and if it's approved, the authorities will issue an authorization. When received, preferential origin can be claimed for the finished product if all other rules are met, regardless of whether or not the preferential components or the non-preferential components were used. This is only allowed in cases where, from an accounting point of view, the segregation of the stock is possible, and provided no more finished products attract the preferential origin compared to the number of originating raw materials components that have entered into the production process. And this system is referred to as the accounting segregation of stocks of materials, and you do need to have quite good stock management systems in place to be able to use it. Finally, accessories, spare parts, tools and sets. This comes up a lot. In cases where accessories, spare parts and tools are shipped separately, the origin determination process, which I will describe shortly, is to be followed from beginning to end. However, in order to simplify this process, these components receive the same origin as the main product, if they can be considered as part of the normal equipment and are invoiced at the same time, so that they are included in the product price. Under those circumstances, they can be called a set. Sets as defined according to General Interpretive Rule 3B of the Harmonised System can claim preferential origin only when all components of the set are considered as having preferential origin. And in case a set is composed of different components, some of which have preferential origin and others not, the entire set can still claim preferential origin provided the value of the non-originating parts does not exceed 15% of the ex works price. So you can see this is similar to the general tolerance rule, but it's strictly to be applied to sets. For spare parts, if the spare part forms part of the standard equipment and is presented as standard with that piece of equipment, you might think about the tools that come with IKEA flat pack furniture or something like that. It will assume the same origin as the equipment, providing they are shipped together. So a whole load of other things for you to be aware of when you're importing and exporting under preference there. So this slide here takes you through the process that you need to follow if you want to determine whether your products or the components, raw materials that you're importing can qualify for preferential treatment. So the basic steps, first of all, you need to find out from the HMRC tariff, and I've included the link there that you can use to look it up, which 4-figure tariff heading covers the goods, whether it's the finished product, the raw materials, components, etc. You only need the first 4 figures for reference to the free trade agreement, but for everything else you will need the 8-digit export code or the 10-digit import code. And it's absolutely crucial to get this right because everything else flows from it. So as I said, I've included the link there, but bear in mind, you should also check the tariff of the other country involved in the import-export as best practice. For example, you would need to check the Northern Ireland tariff. They have their own tariff, or the EU tariff, or the USA tariff, whichever other country is involved, look at both. Once you've got the correct subheading code, refer to the rules of the relevant trade agreement to find out what rules of origin are applicable to that code. All the trade agreements the UK has with other countries are available to download, and I've included the link here. Of course, having the time and patience to wade through them is another matter entirely, and most companies sub it out to someone like me who perversely enjoys doing these things. Then you need to decide which rule is most suitable for your circumstances, whether it's the tariff shift, the value percentage, or specific process. If you're using the value percentage rule, and it's a complex finished product, but only a small percentage of the inputs are non-originating, check if you can use the general tolerance rule first, because it will save you a lot of time. And then finally, if you're using the specific process rule, check the annex of the rules of origin of the FTA to ensure your process confers originating status. Now, I should say that this process that I've described here is most relevant to UK manufacturers planning to export. If you're importing materials or components to use in a finished product for export, you'll need your suppliers to tell you what the origin is. And if you have a complex supply chain spanning many countries or customs territories, I strongly recommend setting up a matrix that includes the source country of everything on your bill of materials and monitoring it closely. But again, that's something that you might want to get a customs professional to do for you. Once you've completed the process and it turns out you can't claim preference when you export your products, what do you do? Basically, it just means that your customer will have to pay import duty when the goods arrive in their country. So you'll want to find out how much the duty will be that they're going to have to pay and factor it into your selling price to make sure you're still competitive with local suppliers or manufacturers who can claim preference. If you're importing goods and your supplier can't provide you with the documents to prove they are correct in claiming preference for the products they've sold you, you will have to pay import duty. Depending on how much it is and what your relationship is like, it may be worth finding an alternative supplier or working with your supplier so they can claim preference. And it's your responsibility to check that the goods you import and don't pay duty on do comply with rules of origin, because if your HMRC checks, you will have to pay the duty plus interest plus a fine, probably, if it turns out that you avoided the duty when you shouldn't have done. And also, all of your imports and possibly exports might be scrutinised much more closely in the future, which you really want to avoid. So, proving preferential origin. Many of you will have exported using certificates of origin that are stamped by a Chamber of Commerce. Just a quick note on that. You don't need to be a member of a chamber, but there are certain formalities to go through before the Chamber of Commerce can authorise certificates of origin for you. But obviously that's the case whether you're a member or not. But once that's out of the way, the process is all done electronically and it's fairly quick and painless, assuming you provide all the information correctly. If you do decide to join a chamber, it doesn't have to be your local one. You can join any of them. And it's worth checking what rates different chambers charge for the certificates of origin, because it can vary quite widely. So if you do need to use them a lot, there are significant savings to be made by finding a chamber that charges less than one of the others. For many countries, certificates of origin will still be required, but for exports to the EU, they haven't been necessary since January 1st, 2021. Instead, it was permissible to state on the commercial invoice, which, as I said before, is a legal document, that your goods complied with rules of origin and nobody was checking, because there was an easement in place the government introduced to try and soften the impacts of Brexit. But from the beginning of this year, customs agents will be looking at this much more closely and may ask to see the evidence of origin. So if you're a manufacturer, that could be your bill of materials, or you could get a long-term declaration from your supplier if you buy the goods you export from somewhere else. In this instance, your supplier needs to be able to prove preference, and so it goes on up the chain. Likewise, if you export to an EU company regularly, they may ask you to complete a long-term declaration. Now, I haven't been able to find a link to the long-term suppliers declaration. It is a specific document that's included in Annex 2 of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. But if you contact me afterwards, then I'll be able to send you the PDF. EUR1s are preference documents used when exporting to countries that have an agreement with the EU, such as Switzerland and the other EEA countries. And you may also need them if you are selling to countries like South Korea and the order is of a higher value than €6,000. So I think that covers proof. Let's just talk about becoming an authorised exporter. If you regularly export to a preference country, i.e. one that we have a trade agreement with, you might want to consider applying to become an approved exporter by filling out the form C1454, which is available on the HMRC website. If approved, it means basically that when you're exporting, the goods are automatically considered to be originating. The declaration can be provided with an invoice or the packing list or delivery note. The declaration has a no value limit. So as I said, some countries like South Korea have for purchases over €6,000, an EUR1 isn't sufficient. And you will be provided with an authorization number and the correct wording to put on the declaration. It's quite an onerous process, but if you're doing business with certain countries that we have trade agreements with, the EUR1 just isn't accepted, and you'll need to go through this process. There's a lot of information on the HMRC website about that. I'm very conscious of time. What do you want to do, Catherine? Because
I was just about to say to you, we've actually got quite a lot of questions in. So if we skip this slide for now,
yeah,
and if we've got time, we can come back to it.
Absolutely. So I will just tell you very, very quickly about the other changes that came into effect at the beginning of year. I've already told you about proof of origin. You also need to be aware that importing from the EU has become a bit more complicated. EU traders have to provide full customs declarations up front rather than having 175 days to complete them, which they did previously. You might have seen on the news the queues at Calais and Dover last week. That was a result of this new system that's come in. So there are two models to be aware of. The pre-lodgement model, which is where importers complete all the declarations before the goods leave the EU and customs clearance takes place while the goods are in transit, or the temporary storage model, where businesses provide the information required before their goods board the ferry and customs formalities are completed while goods are temporarily stored after arriving in a GB port. So there are pros and cons to both of them, depending on what your goods are. If they are perishable, you're going to want to use the pre-lodgement model. But your transport company will be able to advise you on that. And also be aware that commodity codes, they get refreshed every 5 years. It just so happened that it fell on the 1st of January this year. So some commodity codes will have changed, and it's definitely worth checking that yours are still the same before you start exporting again, especially in electronics. There were quite a lot of changes. And then these are some useful links that will be sent to you later. And now I can talk to you about, I can do the questions. I'm so sorry that my video is not working. I don't know why. You don't need to see this.
I'm gonna see if I'm gonna can make myself presenter and end your sharing, and hopefully at the bottom you should have a start video. If not, everyone can just stare at my aha, here you are.
Hello everyone, sorry about that. Must have been incredibly boring looking at those slides, but anyway.
Like, my goodness, there was so much there. Thank you so much. Like,
Yep.
that was incredible. And a lot of people are asking, are they going to get the slides and recordings so they can refer back? Absolutely yes, because there was so much. Although I did say to bring a pen and pencil. So the first question is from Caitlin. Caitlin, you've written quite a lot of questions, which is amazing. I love a lot of questions, but I am going to spread them out over everyone else's. So Caitlin's first question was, online trading of goods and services seems to be the most complicated in determining origin, and online trading of goods seems to be the most complex area, and it seems impossible to determine one's obligations. One example is Amazon is simply separated its UK and EU operations. Do you have any suggestions or any thoughts on this?
It is really difficult, and again, there have been a lot of changes recently which make it very difficult for companies to know what their obligations are. If you're selling through Amazon, they do now have to take responsibility as far as the VAT is concerned, but if you're asking about commodity codes and checking origin, that's all still with you. If I haven't answered your question properly, Caitlin, if I haven't understood it, do contact me afterwards and I can go into it in more detail. And also there's another webinar going on at 5 o'clock this afternoon, which I can share the link for perhaps, because that goes into e-commerce, online selling, who's responsible for doing what, VAT, fulfillment centers and all that kind of thing. So that might be of interest to people. So I will send Catherine the link to forward on to everyone afterwards.
Fantastic. So Haley asks, if I bring a product in from Japan under their free trade, or the UK and Japan free trade agreement, I stock it in the UK and then ship the same product to a European customer, does the European customer have to pay duty, or is this included in the free trade agreement?
If you paid import duty on it when it came into the UK, and then you're exporting it to the EU and it qualifies for preferential origin, then no, your EU customer doesn't, but that's only if you paid the duty when it came in from Japan. If you didn't, then your EU customer will have to pay.
Fantastic. Sorry, I just saw another question in there. Thank you, Frederick, for that comment. So James asks, if exporting goods using a HS code that has a 0 rate of duty, are they still obligated to provide a certificate of origin if requested by the customer?
Yes.
Wow, that was a nice easy question. And then Elizabeth and Danny have asked slightly similar questions, so I'm going to kind of clump them together. So Elizabeth has asked, how are rules of origin applied to intangible products such as software? And then Danny also, actually, we'll start with that one and then I'll move on to Danny, your question.
That is a really good question. As far as I'm aware, rules of origin don't apply to services and intangible products, but I would need to check that for you and maybe put you in touch with someone who is more of an expert in that field than I am. Because I come from a manufacturing background, I tend to just deal with stuff that's made and moved around, physical things. But to the best of my knowledge, they don't apply, but I will find out for you.
Because Elizabeth, I think you've joined one of our webinars before. Either you or someone else has asked a similar question about, because they were taking the software on a USB, which is obviously tangible.
Yes.
So I don't know if that alters anything. I don't know if that was you, Elizabeth, or whether I don't know.
That's a really good point. I would need to have a look at the free trade agreement, to be honest, to see whether those products have been included or not. Yeah, I would need to do some more research for you on that. Sorry.
Oh gosh, no. I mean, there are so many things.
Yeah.
So Danny asks, we're manufacturing an AI computer and we have all our raw material supply chain outside of the UK, i.e. the electronic components, but the design and manufacturing is done here in the UK. Can we claim UK origin?
It goes back to all of the preferential rules that I talked about before. So where you're importing them from, whether you're importing them under preference, so are you paying import duty on those things, and then whether one of the rules of origin applies. So is there a tariff shift? Are you adding enough value to use the value percentage rule, or are you using a specific manufacturing process that's listed in the FTA? So to check that, you would need all of the commodity codes for all of the components that you're using, and then the source country of all of the components. And then you need to refer to the FTA to see which rule you could use.
Amazing. I'm going to go back to one of Caitlin's questions, which is what happens if a business makes an honest mistake due to the chaotic environment? And having watched this presentation, I see how it could be done. Will they still be fined or punished? What happens?
Well, there's a certain amount of leeway at the moment. HMRC do understand that a lot of people weren't aware of these rules. So if it's your first offence, and if you discover it, whatever you do, tell them. Don't try and hide it. I know it's very tempting to just think, oh, they haven't noticed, but don't. Go to them and say, look, it was an honest mistake. Happy to rectify it, because further down the line that will stand you in very good stead. So yes, there is a certain amount of leeway at the beginning, but if you haven't got this sorted out by the end of March, they're going to be a lot more strict about it.
Fantastic. So Taryn asks, we sell kits with multiple components in them, each originating in different countries. How do we go about, where would we start determining the rules of origin for the kit?
Yeah, so this goes back to, I mentioned you need to create a matrix. So you need your bill of materials, start with your bill of materials, then list the commodity code for each item on your bill of materials, also the source country, and then you need to go back to the free trade agreement that's relevant for each country that you're importing from, and just check that what the rates of duty are and whether any of the preferential rules apply. It is quite a time-consuming process, but I'm afraid it does have to be done now.
Perfect. So Tim asks, if the value percentage rule says that a product is 60% UK made, can made in the UK be put on the packaging?
That's a really good question. Yes, if you, in fact, origin has nothing to do with whether you can put made in the UK on it, as far as I'm aware. I will check back through my labelling notes, but yes, I would say that you definitely can. If you've manufactured a product in the UK, regardless of whether the source materials came from somewhere else, if you've manufactured it here, you can say that it's made in the UK.
Amazing. Abdul asks, what is the impact of UKCA? Oh, no, sorry. What impact UKCA can have on the manufacturing end as well as the trading product into the UK from EU and non-EU countries? Not sure I understood. Do you understand that question?
No.
You might have to just sorry, Abdul, you might just have to clarify that.
If I could have a bit of context, maybe.
Perfect. So Sean asks, we're a metal finishing company, but I think what they're asking is pertinent across sectors. They get sent nuts and bolts and screws from the EU for chemical processing and painting. These parts are then returned to the sender. They normally declare the parts as EU origin. Is that correct? They're the same thing, but they've just been treated.
Yes, that's absolutely fine.
Perfect. And then Russell asks, there's so many questions. I'm loving this. This is fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. So Russell asks, going back to the fertilizer example, does the general tolerance and the specific list rule example that you gave override the other percentage criteria?
Um, which other percentage criteria?
We might have to come back to you on that one, Russell. Just because we've got quite a lot to get through. And we're already 3 minutes.
It doesn't matter. You can, whichever of the rules your product complies with, as far as preference is concerned, you can use it. I think maybe I wasn't clear. There were so many different contexts in which I talked about percentage. Perhaps I wasn't clear.
No, I did.
But again, I mean,
my
my contact details will be on the slides that get sent out. So please do email me afterwards if I'm not able to explain anything today.
And Ian, I'm actually going to ask you to message Lucinda that question as well. Andy asks, we manufacture packaging for food, labels and sleeves. Do we need to have rules of origin for printing machines and the tools used in the manufacture of the goods?
No, as long as you're not exporting them anywhere or importing them, if they're just machines that are used in your manufacturing process, no, you don't need to. It's just the materials, the components, the parts that are involved in the manufacturing process.
Fab. And I'm just going to finish on one because I think oh no, actually, let's do Trevor's. Trevor has asked, can value be classed as a skill? Sorry. I can read, I promise. Trevor asks, can value be classed as skilled labour, e.g. a technician assembling a complex server system and programming it before export?
No.
Perfect. And Caitlin asks, is there a link which they can use to look up the required FTA percentages? But I think That's one of the ones you've got at the end there.
It should be. I did include, I'm sure on one of the slides, I included the link where you can download all of the free trade agreements that we have with all of the countries. I'm sure that was on there. So it will be included in the slide deck for you. And then you can just find the relevant one to you.
Fantastic. And then a final question. Sorry, Tim has just written in to clarify, and so Tim has written in, just to clarify, I think you said labour, overhead profit and research can be used as part of the originating country for value percentage rule. It's so hard when you've got me reading off so many things.
They're not included in the Ex Works price. Only tangible things are included in the Ex Works price. So the cost of the components, parts, materials are included, and then obviously you add on profit, overheads to get the. I'm so sorry. Right. Okay. I understand your question now. They're not included in in the cost price, but yes, you do add them on. I'm so sorry. You do add them on to your final price. Yes. So they can, under those circumstances, yes, things like that are included in the price. Yeah.
Amazing. And then just one last question from Prashant. What help can the Chamber of Commerce provide?
The Chamber can usually offer advice and guidance. They can put you in touch with other organisations that could be helpful. They can tell you about funding often. They also provide training, which is very useful. So it does tend to vary from chamber to chamber. And also, if you're looking for advice, the Institute of Exports and International Trade is very good. And of course, the Department for International Trade is always available to help.
I was about to blow our own trumpet. Perfect. So I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you everyone so much for attending today. I hope you found it useful. Thank you, Lucinda. That was absolutely amazing.
Pleasure.
I hope to see you all at future Export Academy webinars.